I started studying Marxism like a couple of months ago during quarantine. And I've always kind of wondered, like, the most famous communist states that we hear of seem to end in dictatorship and worse conditions for the proletariat and the working class people. And I was wondering, like, what mechanisms we could put in place in our current movement to try and prevent that sort of thing from happening. Like, how we can make sure that doesn't occur, because that is like the scariest part of Marxism a little bit for me, I would say.
I was actually going to jump in on the same question that Mason asked earlier about how we can hopefully relate Marx to people in a way that's a little less intimidating. So one thing I've always found really helpful, because I've always been kind of that guy who would go into my minimum wage job and just start radicalizing coworkers as best I could, is that a lot of people are kind of resistant to Marx's texts, due to size and due to language and it being somewhat intimidating up front, and along with, as Stephanie said, all the historical baggage that comes with it. But I've yet to meet anyone who's scared of discussing their own working conditions, how their boss comes into work every day driving a car that's 10 times nicer than theirs, but sits in the back office and, screws around on Instagram all day. We've all been there. I'm sure most of us have had just everyday little situations in the workplace like that can be brought in as personal examples of how the system has failed us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on the relevance of the Communist Manifesto. Now, we are Fight Back. We are a revolutionary organization fighting against capitalism and all forms of injustice. And not only are we building the forces of good in Canada, we're also part of the international Marxist tendency, and we're fighting to overthrow this rotten capitalist system that we all live under.
The bourgeoisie is the ruling class. There are those who own capital, who own the means of production. Meaning they own the materials, they own the tools, the machines, the workplaces, all those things that the proletariat need to use to produce. The proletariat, on the other hand, or the working class, only owns one thing, their labor power. This is the role of the Marxists. To guide the working class movement by injecting it with the correct ideas and the correct programs, the working class can ultimately take power and begin to fundamentally transform society. The only way to accomplish this is to replace the economic basis of capitalism by abolishing private property. More specifically, the private ownership of the means of production. Private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. So what this means is that the grand majority of people in the world don't own private property. They don't own banks. They don't have any monopolies. They don't own any factories. And for the few that do, the only way that they can have them and keep them is by preventing any of us from ever having those things. And this is what Fight Back and the International Marxist Tendency aims to do. We openly declare that we intend to bury the decrepit capitalist system, but we can't do it alone. Above all else, what capitalism creates is its own grave diggers. So grab a shovel and join us.
Thank you for the presentation. and I'm new to learning about Marxism, so excuse my ignorance for this question. But for example, how would the housing change? Because in a Marxist system, like the concept of profit, for example, the meaning changes. So, for example, if we lived in a Marxist society, how would private housing, like the way we have our houses right now and how we live, how would that change?
My question is just about what transition from either feudalism to capitalism and then now capitalism into ostensibly Marxism, what that would look like and if that was addressed by Marx in his writings. And is it an inherently, like, as an overthrow of society, do people believe that there's an opportunity for like a peaceful transition, or is it just kind of in general believed that it has to be a violent overthrow?
I was watching the classes with my mom, and I just had a question, just a small question of if the whole community goes into a Marxist state, then how will the trade and business go on? So how would that happen if it was in a Marxist state?
I wish my mother would attend these sessions. She's just not into it, unfortunately.
You may not have felt this way when you were in school, but some students, they looked at another boy or they looked at another girl and they saw that this person was more intelligent, maybe more well-spoken, maybe more attractive. And instead of just being happy for that other person, they felt that things would be a lot better for them, things would be a lot more equal if that other person was eliminated. People who are recruiting young minds into communism make use of this envy, make use of this feeling of jealousy toward people who seem to have more than you, who seem to have something that you lack. In the case of communist ideology, it's usually not about somebody's looks, it's not about their intelligence. In this case, it's appealing to the envy and jealousy that people feel towards those who have more money, towards those who have better cars, towards those who have better homes, actually owning a home as opposed to renting an apartment. I have had about 13 different jobs in my life, and many of them were minimum wage jobs. They were the most menial jobs you can imagine. And I had the experience of seeing my boss working less than me, but earning more money. In certain positions where I would work for a fast food chain, I would see the head of the franchise come in maybe once a week just to look at the place. And they came in a fancy car, they drove up in a fancy car, they walked in, they were wearing professional, expensive looking clothes, and I could see that they were wealthier than me. They were wealthier than all of my coworkers as well. What communists talk about is owning the means of production. And in this sense, I really just don't get it. I really think this is a stupid line of thought. And if you've actually worked in a fast food restaurant, who has worked there has thought, you know what, my life would be a lot better if I owned this fryer, if I myself could own this whole building, if I was responsible for owning this building, and if I had to pay the rent to lease this place so that this fast food restaurant would stay in business. There's a lot of responsibility that goes into that if you just work as a minimum wage worker, you don't have to deal with that responsibility. Wouldn't it be even more absurd to say that my life would be better, my job would be better, if instead of working for this corporate boss, that I was working for the government? If this fast food restaurant was owned by the government? Communists promise you equality. But if you worked for a company, if you worked for a fast food chain, and it was owned by the government, there would still be a man who would show up, driving a car more expensive than you could ever afford. There would still be this man showing up in clothes more expensive than you could ever afford. And it's the same situation still, but this time, instead of working for a man who's risked his own money, who's risked his own livelihood in order to get to this position, you're working for a government bureaucrat. You are under the supervision of a government bureaucrat. This isn't equality. This is the same system, but the ownership is through the government rather than private industry. In a communist society, will there still be teachers and will there still be students? There is always going to be this fundamental inequality between people. And in a communist society, there will still be a military, right? There will still be different ranks within the military. There will still be infantrymen, there will still be commanders, there will still be generals. There will be political leaders, and there will be political followers. The communists promise equality, but really all that they can offer is to destroy the banks, to destroy the stock market, to destroy the private sector, and replace it with government bureaucracy.